Thanks very much, Sarah. My name's Ben Hamilton. I'm a Managing Director in the Strategic Communications segment of FTI based in Sydney. My background is in corporate reputation and in public affairs, and in those areas, working with clients to defend corporate reputation and to manage crises and incidents. Prior to joining FTI, I spent 10 years in the energy industry, so well across issues relating to high risk and highly regulated industries. Joining me today is my colleague Cameron Morse from the Perth office. Cam.
Yeah, thanks everyone for joining. Look, my background is as a journalist, and I've been working, providing advice to companies for the last 15 or so years across a whole range of industries. But crisis communications has tended to be, one of our jobs that keeps unfortunately reoccurring. So looking forward to chatting a bit more in depth today. Although when I look at this slide, I think some of the photos might need a bit updating. I look a lot younger in the photo than I do in real life.
So FTI Consulting, as Sarah said, is a broad-based independent business advisory firm. The segment that Cameron and I work for is strategic communications, and strategic communications is about helping clients use their communications assets to manage incidents and to protect and build corporate reputation. We support clients from a range of different industries and different sectors in different geographies around the world. And the wheel there shows some of the services that we provide, everything from capital markets, transaction support, through to managing the impact of unsettling events and events which often come at a point of inflection for a company. And certainly crisis and issues management fits into a number of the segments of that wheel. And that's what we want to talk to you about over the course of the next little while. And happy to take questions as we go as well.
I'll talk about this slide. I'm not going to run through the dot points. I've picked two issues I'd sort of like to draw out a little bit. One is workplace injuries and fatalities. I think I did a quick summary the other day. I think I've dealt with 14 or 15 incidents where there's been fatalities. And two of the biggest issues I see when they occur is, firstly, how to characterise a fatality when there's been no official pronouncement that the person is deceased. It's really difficult for companies because it's quite obvious, someone has died. But at the same time, unless a policeman or a medical practitioner has made the pronouncement, then there's a reluctance to actually say that they have in fact haven't died. And that leads to the second one is when to advise the next of kin. And although this isn't necessarily a communications issue, it can be if handled incorrectly. There's a real reluctance for companies to actually go and tell the next of kin that unfortunately their loved one has died. And I get that reluctance, absolutely. There's a view within companies that's the police's job. But the police won't do it unless someone, has been officially pronounced dead, and then they need to find out who the next of kin, and that all takes time. And what you've got to do is put yourself in the family situation. If you know that your loved one, has suffered a fatal injury, you want to be told as soon as possible. And I've had examples of where the company has said, no, we need to wait for the police to inform the family. But what we've had is journalists are then ringing up the family saying, look, can you talk about, your loved one who's died? And so they've actually heard about it from the media, and the reputational damage to the company when that happens is immense. So, my advice there is as hard as it is, you need to be the one doing it. With the second one I want to talk about is data and cyber breaches. Look, they're becoming increasingly prevalent, and I think what we've seen is when it first happened, companies were sort of being blamed for having lax IT in letting these perpetrators in and steal data or install ransomware. But now it's moved, that it's just so widespread that people are accepting that it can't be their fault. And as long as, and this is the key, as long as companies don't try to hide it or downplay it, there is an acceptance. But I think in time, what we're going to see is the needle swing back where the public will say, well, hang on, you know that people are trying to infiltrate your systems, and you haven't done a good enough job in protecting my data. And so they're going to become more critical of companies where this occurs. Not happening now, but I think it's inevitable.
We'll come to some of the best practice around how companies should be prepared and scenario planning for the common types of incidents or crises that may hit. But one of the points that I'll carry on from Cam's explanation of data and cyber just there is that companies do need to start scenario planning those incidents into their crisis communications material. Quite often we find that they will be built into business continuity or business recovery frameworks, but they just need to be built into the crisis communications scenario planning as well. The other point that I'll make off this slide is the last one, and it's around the litigation support. I'll make it very clear that neither Cameron or I are lawyers, and FTI is not a law firm, but what we do is work very closely with legal counsel, whether that's internal or external, through the litigation processes that often follow from an incident or a crisis, and whether that's an investigation, a regulatory proceeding, a legal proceeding, we are in lockstep with legal counsel to make sure that the company's reputation and the company's communications are accurate, that they're timely, and that they are consistent. And when I talk about consistency, I talk about consistency in terms of what is being said internally and what is being said externally to a whole range of stakeholders. So we'll come back to that in some detail a little later. So look, one of the things that we're often faced with is companies' threshold for what is a crisis, the difference between a crisis and an issue, or a crisis and a single incident which may become a crisis if it's not managed correctly. And we put them into sort of three broad categories: an accident with some incidents that come off the back of that and then have a flow-on effect downstream, or in this case onshore. Or it could be a reputational challenge where a regulator is starting to push back against claims that are made and is starting to undertake a complex investigation that goes to show that there is a real issue that needs further action from a regulatory perspective. But when you start to look at a definition of crisis, this is the one that I think really is a very effective way of looking at it. And it's drawn from a UK document, which is pretty simple. A crisis is an unprecedented or extraordinary event or situation that threatens an organisation and which requires a strategic, adaptive and timely response. So there's a couple of things in that definition which we always look for when we're starting to look at whether a company is truly in crisis, whether it's a trigger for a crisis communications plan to be activated, or when we're working with companies to develop the frameworks and the policies and the thresholds at which they invoke their crisis communications protocols. Strategic, adaptive and timely response are the three things that we look for. Cam, did you want to add anything to that?
And I think those three words are key. I mean, and the first one really goes to preparation, which we'll talk about later. If you're making tactical decisions on the run in a time of immense pressure, then invariably, I was going to say you're doomed to fail, but invariably your response is not as good as it could be, and you'll suffer reputational and commercial impacts as a result. Adaptive, look, curveballs are going to be thrown. In most of the crises I've been working on, the playing field that you started is not the playing field that you end with. Things are going to happen, and I guess in the words of I think it was Dirty Harry, you need to improvise, adapt and overcome. And timely, look, we live in an information age where information travels around the world almost instantaneously, and I guess that's one of my recommendations is, if in doubt, call your whole team out. What you don't want to do is sort of say, it might not escalate, so therefore I'll leave everyone at home. Because if you do that and it does escalate, then you're just behind the eight ball for the rest of the crisis almost. So, mobilise people as quickly as possible. Most of them will be, are professionals and will accept that that's why you've done it. And if you've got to send them home, then send them home. But I'd rather have them in the office and send them home rather than be in the office and wish they were here because they're chucked up in bed.
The point around the timely response is critical as well. There's sort of a there's a window of time after an incident, after a storm, after a fire, after an accident, where the company can establish their position in relation to the issue. And even if it's just to say we acknowledge that there has been an impact to our operations from incident X, more detail will be forthcoming as we know it. That's perfectly okay. What you need to do in a time of crisis from a communications and reputation management perspective is take control of the narrative. You need to be prepared to tell your own worst story, because if you don't do that, somebody else will, and we've seen that happen on a number of occasions. So look, stages of a crisis is an interesting one to think about. That sort of predict piece goes to something that I mentioned earlier, where we do start to look at how we war game or scenario plan or build up a number of potential scenarios around what a crisis could be. And this is really around working with the internal teams at clients, everyone from the risk managers through the comms team, through the legal team, and to the OH&S teams in some companies, to start to look at what might happen. Start to work with companies through preparedness, so that when you do get to a point of an issues trigger or an actual incident, which then escalates into a full-blown crisis response, the company is well prepared and best prepared to react, to manage, and to then very quickly, once the incident is over or the incident is being managed, to move into that recovery phase to the right-hand side of the continuum there. The time frame on these can be extremely compressed, or they can be very, very long. We have clients that we work with on an annual basis to refresh and revise the types of plans that are mentioned on the left-hand side, or we can get called in with half an hour's notice to be on a site because an incident has occurred, and we are working very quickly through the latter stages of that continuum. We'll go into some of those in a little more detail in a moment. So we have a framework for best practice crisis management, and it's really across 3 phases. We're going to talk about those in a moment, but the sort of 3 guiding principles that we look at, successful crisis comms is heavily dependent upon the ability to gather, understand, and then disseminate the right information to the right people at the right time. As I said, we start with scenario planning in an ideal situation. That can be something that happens on an annual basis. If we're called into a situation where we're literally dropped into an organisation to assist in managing the crisis, our first task will be to understand what exists. What do you have? What information do you know? What are the pre-approved statements that you can use as holding statements? What are you comfortable in saying, and who's going to say it? Is it the job of the CEO to speak on behalf of the organisation? Is it the Chief Operations Officer? Is it a company spokesperson who is out during those initial phases? And if it is, at what stage do you escalate that to involve somebody from the executive leadership team? Our approach in all of this is to quickly take control of the narrative, as I said. Filling the space, filling the speculation, correcting the misinformation is absolutely critical. You have to establish that position early and commit to providing more up-to-date information as you roll through the stages of the crisis, the stages of the incident management. Cam, did you want to add anything to that?
I agree. One of the issues I see with companies is they're always trying to get more information. And when you're in the middle of a crisis, more information keeps coming into your IMT or EMT or whatever acronym you want to use for your crisis management team. And there's a temptation going, okay, we've prepared this communications. Oh, we've got new information in, it can't go out. So therefore you add the new information in, you get it all approved. And by the time you get that second communications schedule ready to roll, then another batch of new information comes in. And if you keep doing that, it'll get to the point where you never ever send anything out. So I sort of recommend to my clients who are confronted with this is you need to put information out that is current at the time and then continually update.
Yep, very good point. There's a particular challenge in crisis situations, which is neatly summarised on this slide, and it's the multiple stakeholders. You've got employees, you've got investors, regulators, customers, business partners. You've got members of the community who may be impacted or affected, or may have seen or may have heard about an incident that's occurred on a site. And then you've got media. And across all of that, you've got a 24-hour news cycle. You've got the emergence of social media as some people's primary source of information. You've got the fact that anyone with a phone, with a camera and a Twitter account becomes a citizen reporter, and can be feeding the information and the news flow in a way that it just didn't occur 10, 15, 20 years ago. So managing those multiple stakeholders in a timely manner, being able to adapt to the changing nature of the situation is absolutely critical. And that's where it comes into play, a very structured approach to crisis communications.
Yeah, and yet in one sense, this diagram is slightly wrong in that all these stakeholders influence each other. They're not compartmentalised. So the key there is, there's a lot of stakeholders there, and we've listed 6 or 7, and there's stakeholders within stakeholders. So you've got to have a team big enough to get to all those stakeholders. One person sort of sitting there trying to communicate with employees, investors, customers is just not going to be able to do it. They're going to get swamped. So you need to grab people in and make sure that you cover off those stakeholders in a really disciplined manner. You can't let people fall through the cracks, and I guess that comes to preparation, which we'll talk about shortly.
And it also speaks to the need to actually have an up-to-date register of who your critical stakeholders are across those different categories, because it's no use trying to reach out to somebody on a disconnected phone number, somebody who has changed roles, changed offices, an MP who may no longer be the responsible local member, and things like that. So it generally falls to the corporate affairs and corporate communications team to maintain those sort of key stakeholder logs, particularly as they relate to the crisis communications manual. But I can't stress enough the criticality of having up-to-date information. As Cam says, it does go to preparedness.
And so, look, I admit it's a pretty thankless task. Every quarter or every half year, updating all that information. But when a crisis hits, you'll be appreciative that you've put in that work.
That's right. So we've mentioned the sort of 3-phase approach that we take to crisis management, and in our view, this is how any best practice crisis management framework should be approached: preparedness, response, and recovery. Ideally, we work with clients through the 3 phases of that. Often we're called in the middle, where we are working a little, I wouldn't say blind, but we're working with existing materials that we haven't necessarily developed and that we haven't stress tested with the client. And as I said, our first task in that is to crack on and identify what exists, identify the gaps, and then work with the communications, the legal, the risk, the occupational health and safety teams to get a very quick handle on what the situation is, and then move into the response phase. The recovery phase can be a day after the incident, can be a week, depending on what it is. It can be several months after the incident, and there may be phases within the recovery phase as well, as more information is known. I'll throw to Cam to talk through each of those phases, and I see that there's some questions coming in, so we will come back to those in a moment as well.
So we'll go to preparedness. We've listed sort of 3 boxes there. Preparedness is one of those things where it's often regarded by senior management as a nice to have rather than a need to have. So rather than sort of going through how we go about preparing a company for a crisis, I thought I'd give people who are in this seminar perhaps some tools that might help them convince the chief executive or whatever the need to do it. So a couple of years ago, FTI did a study of 100 crises all around the world. And we looked at various outcomes that had occurred as a result of those crises, and as a result of how the crises were managed as well. Now, what we found was from those 100 crises, 32%, so 1 in 3 of senior executives lost their job. There was a value destruction in share prices of $200 billion, and 14%, so 14 of those 100 companies went out of business. And if they're not compelling figures for senior executives to say, wow, this is a real issue and I need to invest in making sure we respond appropriately, then I don't know what is, I guess particularly around the 1 in 3 senior execs losing their jobs. So you'll get a link to that report later on today with the slide deck. Please have a read of it. It's got some really interesting figures in there, and I hope they'll be useful for you at some stage in making sure that you are prepared for a crisis. Go on to the next slide, unless you've got something to add, Ben.
No, I think the third box there is an interesting one as well, and something that we stress with clients quite often, particularly in high risk and manufacturing industries and other industries of that nature. There is a full BCP or disaster recovery process that's undertaken each year, and there is always a communications element to that. But what we work with communications teams to do is really fully stress test the crisis communications response that is part of that. We have live crisis simulation sessions. We have online crisis simulation tools, and we really amp up the stress on the communications team and the broader team that is called in to assist in a reputation management and crisis communications response, to make sure that what is in the manual, what is in the procedures, what is in the pre-approved messaging and the scenario documents actually works, and is for want of a better term, match fit for the company. And if it's not, then we go back to that middle box and redraft, redevelop, and prepare again for those emerging, evolving and changing scenarios.
We'll go into clients and their CMT manual is that thick, and communications is a page, because often they're written by engineers or other personnel within the company, and for them a crisis communications response is a holding statement and a press release, and that's it. And if you're going to actually develop a good crisis communications response, apart from the fact it would be unwieldy, it should be almost that thick as well, because of the number of stakeholders that we talked about earlier, because of the different scenarios. Yeah. So it's really important to have that in advance.
The other thing that we sometimes see when we go into clients is particularly those who are regularly restructured, or that there is a sort of a merger or an acquisition or a divestment, that sometimes the communications collateral that sits in the manuals doesn't necessarily get updated in a timely manner. So again, in that preparedness phase, it's just making sure that what the materials that are there are current, that the people who are named as the sources of information or the spokespeople or the roles that they play within those crisis teams is up to date, that the contact details are right, that the email address is right, that we know where they sit in the building and we know where to go to get that information or that approval, because it's no use going into a comms team and grabbing the red book and finding out that it's completely out of date.
With the testing too, I would add, companies have got to be prepared to train up their B team. Invariably, crises are not over in half a day, where you can put your senior managers in all your communications departments onto the task, and then at the end of it, they wrap it in a nice bow and crisis over and they go home. A lot of crises are drawn out processes, and if you've got your senior team and they're the only ones who've been schooled up, and it's a 24/7 crisis and it goes for a month, they're just going to be burnt out. and incapable of physically doing it. So companies need to, when you have invariably when you have a crisis exercise, it's sort of the senior guys saying, yeah, I'll take 3 hours out and I'll make sure we do this well. But what that's not doing is training up the alternates who, in the event of a prolonged crisis, are going to be called up and need to have that training just as much as the senior guys who are invariably in the A team.
Good point. So crisis response, a different sort of mode of operation, but probably the most critical part of what it is that we need to work with clients to get right.
Yeah, and look, we do say that you need to get a specialist crisis communications team in, and look, that's self-serving, I admit, because that's what we do. But my view on this is, if you've got specialist accounting requirements, well, then you call in an accountant. If you've got specialist legal requirements, you call in a lawyer. And similarly, if you've got specialist crisis communications requirement, then call in people who've done it before, rather than relying on an existing team that is going to be learning on a job. Because if there's any time in a corporation's life cycle that they don't want their team learning on the job, it's in the event of a significant crisis. As a former colleague of mine said, you aren't the person who was putting up your marquee for the Christmas party on a tennis court on Saturday, managing your oil spill response on a Monday. So, get the specialists out. We do talk about in here the importance of monitoring. We talked about earlier about the curveballs that are inevitably going to get thrown, and unless you monitor, you're not going to have all the information. And it's important that monitoring is fed up to the CMT. Otherwise, they're potentially making decisions in that room without all the information available to them. So don't just sort of say, oh, that's good, we're trending on Twitter or not trending on Twitter, and leave that information within the communications team.
Sorry, Cam, that monitoring part, especially the social media monitoring, can be really useful and effective in storm response situations or after a natural disaster, because people are sort of, they're calling out and saying, look at this, look at the damage in my area, look at the damage in my street. I've been without power, I've been without telecommunications, I've been without water for X number of hours. You can actually assist to start to target the response, when you can't necessarily have people out there straight away.
It's funny, I've also been in a crisis situation where the CEO sort of said, because there was chatter occurring on Twitter, and they didn't have a Twitter account, and he said, right, we need to set up a Twitter account, we need to do it now. That's not the time to set up social media channels in the middle of a crisis. If you are in that situation, and ideally you're not, but if you are, what you need to do is basically use journalists who have their own Twitter account as your method to distribute your message. So that's just a little hack for response.
Cam, there's a question that's come in, which is probably quite timely, and we'll go back to some of the earlier ones in a moment. But I just want to go to this one now, and it's can you provide any advice on communications with stakeholders in a university environment with 30,000 plus students that could be potentially affected?
Yeah, and look, and that's where it's important, I guess, to use the communications tools that your stakeholders are using. There's no point if I want to communicate to other companies' CEOs using Twitter. Similarly, I doubt students are going to be I know students are not going to be using LinkedIn. So in the case of university students, obviously Twitter is an important conduit to get information out. And you don't need to put everything out. What we invariably do is have a page on a website or a dark site that we would enact, and then we point people back to that information through the use of social media, whether that's Facebook, whether that's Twitter, and so you're just always driving people back to that website or web page or dark site that's now live.
Yeah, so it's really taking them back to that single source of information.
Yep.
which is regularly updated and maintained, and more importantly, maintained by the company in conjunction with the information that's coming through the CMT or into the crisis room.
Yeah, look, with this slide, as Ben said, nature abhors a vacuum. It will fill it, and in the event of a crisis, often it will be filled with misinformation. So that's where it's really important is, if there's a vacuum, you need to fill it yourself, rather than people who are going to speculate or blame. And that's why we have a rule that we want to get information out within an hour so we'll get to a client's office within an hour, and the absolute limit on when our first release goes out is also an hour, is another hour. Now, ideally, we actually beat that, because we know that if we're not out there talking and at least saying, look, this is what we know and we'll provide you with more information, then other people will do it, and that's when it runs away from you. Misinformation is accepted as fact, unless it's corrected. So you need to jump on any misinformation and correct it. Don't just sit back and go, oh, we'll see if it all blows over, and wait for other people to do it. Companies need to be really proactive in terms of doing that. At the same time, often you're operating in an environment where facts are coming in. So there does need to be a degree of fact checking, and that's where you're continually weighing up, am I sufficiently confident in the information I've got? And if the answer is yes, then you need to get that information out.
The third phase of the sort of the crisis communications management is into the recovery, and the recovery is critical. Obviously, incident response is the central part of it, but it's how companies recover from a crisis that can be just as important. And I think there's sort of 5 steps that we talk about with clients when we go through a recovery phase with them, whether it's the next day, the next week, the next month, or in some cases several months down the track. So past positioning, and when I talk about past positioning, I talk about clearly articulating that the crisis event or the incident or the accident or whatever it was has passed, and that the company has committed to a certain series of activities, whether that's an investigation, a review, compensation perhaps for customers who are affected, but that it is in the past and that they're moving on. They're taking steps to ensure that a similar incident doesn't occur, or reducing the likelihood of a similar incident occurring in the future, and knowing that the company's operations will adjust accordingly. Talking about the lessons learnt, what did the company find from that? Were there gaps in procedures, and what can you say to various stakeholders about what you've done to identify and mitigate the gaps that were identified in the procedures? And in both of those, there's also could be an element of mea culpa. There's in many incidents nothing wrong with saying that we're sorry. Obviously, legal teams will have a particular view on that as it relates to liability. But if it's a simple sorry for the inconvenience, we appreciate that our customers were inconvenienced. We know that it was a difficult period, things like that. Then those statements that we can agree with legal teams should be used in this as well.
Ben, I think can I just jump in? That's a really important point. And I found, you end up in these fights with lawyers in a crisis comms, in a crisis environment, where they're saying we just cannot admit liability. And saying sorry that an event has occurred is not admitting liability. And you need to be really clear with that, and I think robust in it, because I talked about our crisis survey of the 100 companies before, and that was one of the resounding conclusions, was that not enough companies said sorry, and a lot of them were very slow in doing it as well. So they sort of were dragged kicking and screaming into actually apologising. When it's absolutely fair to say, look, I'm sorry that someone died. I'm sorry that your internet is out. I'm sorry that your data got leaked. because it has happened. Otherwise, we wouldn't be in this situation. And that's not an admission of liability. And I advise people to have that discussions with their legal firms early, rather than doing it in the heat of the moment and having a stand-up debate about it when you've got your second media release ready to go. Is have that discussion in advance with your lawyers so everyone's comfortable with it. And even then, once you have that, document it and have it signed off, so that in the event you are hit by this, then you've got some pre-agreed words that the lawyers can live with and the communicators can live with.
That's right. And in this recovery phase, that sort of goes to that middle box there about rewriting and reframing the story. So what is the new corporate narrative? What are the messages that you're comfortable, that your company is comfortable with using to re-establish some credibility in a reputational sense? And another part of that is re-engaging with key stakeholders. Everybody that you spoke to during the course of that crisis event, whether it was the local council, the neighbours to a site, your workforce, your regulators, the local media, they're probably going to want to know what you did and how you managed the crisis and what you're going to do into the future. So that re-engaging the key stakeholders is a really important part of it. You can't just sort of draw a line under it and think, okay, we're done, put the crisis manual back in the desk until next time. It's an evolutionary process. So it involves updating again and going back to your stakeholders. And then finally, setting out a long-term aspiration. Whether that's a commitment to improve processes, a commitment to new processes, resetting a safety agenda, resetting a goal around a particular issue or an incident or an aspect of your operations. It's really around just re-establishing the company's position in relation to what has happened, what you've done about it, and what you're going to do in the future. Cam, there's a couple of other questions that have come through, and one which is probably quite topical at the moment. How do you feel businesses generally responded to the crisis of COVID-19?
Look, I think actually we have done some work on that, which I think you actually looked at, Ben. My view on it is everyone was impacted by COVID-19, and so I think therefore people are generally accepting of companies' response and the fact that it was a real unknown prior to it. So I think overall it's been pretty good. There's obviously a few issues where companies haven't done very well in explaining their positions or have been slow. Whether it's refunds to holiday makers and things like that. But overall, I think they've done a reasonable job.
Yeah, and just to one of the earlier questions about how you communicate to university students, we did do some work with a university around how they communicate the impacts of COVID and the expectations of what was going to happen on campus, particularly in student accommodation. And the work that we did there was breaking down some very complex, very detailed information that was coming from state and federal health departments and government agencies into some ready reckoners, so into some flow charts that went to very simple explanations. If you're returning to campus and you've been in any of these places, this is what you need to do. If someone in your dorm has a temperature above this, this is what you need to do and what you need to tell them to do. So it's about taking the complexity out of the situation, providing some reassurance, and using the channels that the students were using to most effectively tell that story and get that critical information across. Just looking at a couple of the other questions that have come through. Probably a comment here, which I think we can respond to, Cam. I'd argue that a crisis is a point upon which a company needs to change in a significant way. And the example it's given is the White Island volcanic explosion, where to the tour operators, it was a crisis point. However, to all other players, it was an emergency.
Well, look, I think most crises end up causing change in a company anyway. So I think they're almost interchangeable, and we see with companies, they have a crisis management team or an emergency management team, and their roles are interchangeable. So I think they're very similar.
Mm.
We did, Ben, we also actually did receive some questions earlier about investigations.
Yep, do you want to go to those ones?
Yeah. And the question was, when conducting internal investigations, do you have any tips for disarming staff who become very protective of their actions? And look, I think that's a natural reaction when you go back and look at how people, what they did or how they responded. It's natural for them to be very defensive. I think what you've got to do is talk about the rationale for an internal investigation. And that rationale usually is to learn from what happened and prevent a repeat, rather than being able to get people. And I think if you talk about that to those who are involved in the investigation, I think you're going to get greater cooperation. There was a subsequent question about how do you get contractors to also be part of that follow-up. I think that's a tougher one. Look, I'm not a lawyer, nor's Ben, which we were very clear at the start. Probably goes to preparation in terms of whether you can consider including that in your initial contract with your contractors. But the trouble is, as soon as the lawyers get involved and they write, privileged and confidential on the top of every document, then it can be hard to actually access that information from your contractors and subcontractors. And that goes to an interesting point too. I've been involved in quite a few crises where the in-house lawyer has demanded that we write legal and privileged and confidential on the top of every document we produce in a war room. I've never seen that tested. I doubt a judge would cop to that. And therefore strike out every document on that basis that it had written on the top. But in a high pressure situation, I'm not going to argue. I'm just going to write it on top, and I'll let them duke it out in the courtroom later on if it does get to that.
Another one that's come through is should mitigation not be part of the sequence? So I think the suggestion is that if you mitigate, then would you need to go through that preparation phase? And I guess the answer to that, from my view, is that we prepare for the worst. So all of the mitigation in the world may not stop something from occurring, particularly the curveballs that can be thrown when you're in a crisis event. Cam?
Yeah, no, I agree. There's another question here, Ben, which you can answer. Is there ever a time when you should stop communicating or engaging with complainants that continue to make false and irrational claims and make irrational demands despite being told the facts? If so, how?
Yeah, look, I think there is. And Cam spoke earlier about the need to have that single source of truth, and standing up a page or activating a dark site to take over a corporate website, where you are updating with the known facts and the confirmed facts on a regular basis. So taking the conversations, if they're occurring on social media, and continually pushing people back to that single source of truth is really important. If they're coming in through a contact center or through some other frontline channel, whether it be over a counter or at an office, then de-escalating situations, and we write de-escalation scripts for contact centers and for frontline staff a lot around. We would ask you to take note of this information. They're the kind of ways that we look at doing that.
I think just to add to that, Ben, I presume the question's sort of about a vexatious Twitter user. And I think, if they continue to do that, I think the rest of the Twitterati, tend to then start ignoring them if they're continually banging on, and then they've seen that the company has given a good response. We had a good example, a client who is a food manufacturer. Actually, they had a consumer who was unhappy. Now, the reality of the situation was the consumer actually didn't treat the product in the manner they should have, but still got sick as a result of it. They claim they got food poisoning. And all of a sudden, this company was confronted with the complainants. There were 30,000 shares and 40,000 likes or something like that. So it just exploded, and there were newspaper articles. what we actually did was we said to the original complainant, look, there was an issue with some of the labelling, perhaps it wasn't as clear. So we actually got them involved in testing the new labels that we were going to put on to correct the problem. And then they ended up sort of, I guess, advocating for our response to their issue. So that was to me, that was a really good example of turning around what was a negative issue, and it was a negative issue. But we sort of were able to cauterize it and turn it around and make it a positive in the end.
Yeah. I think if the complainant and the repeated complaints are occurring on social media channels, provided that the company has a very clear set of house rules for how they will engage and how they will respond, and those house rules are known to people, you know, a pinned Facebook post, a pinned tweet or something like that, which says, you know, we ask you to be respectful, we will respond to you as we can, etc., etc., then it's entirely reasonable to then, you know, not respond, I think is probably the best way to put it. Cam, a specific question there about Western Australia, which you may want to take a look at.
Yeah, So in Western Australia, they're in the process of enacting industrial manslaughter provisions, which will provide for increased fines and also jail time for executives of companies that have unsafe workplaces. So, you know, the stakes are really being raised for senior management. And, you know, we've had quite a few workplace fatalities, and I guess what they're trying to do is make sure that CEOs are accountable, and by doing that, I guess, get them to place additional focus on safety. In terms of then how does that impact your crisis communications response? Look, again, it probably goes to whether you say sorry. In terms of your messages that a fatality has occurred, for example, I don't think it changes it. I haven't sat down with any lawyers and had that discussion, given that this legislation hasn't been actually officially enacted yet. But I can't see it changing, is the answer.
All right. Just wary of time this morning. Just to sum up, I think, you know, we've given you a sort of a top level view of the criticality of crisis communications preparedness, crisis communications response, and some of the practical activities that can happen through that recovery phase. Both Cam and I would be happy to talk further about this if people have individual questions or specific situations that you'd like to cover off. We will provide a version of that slide deck and the links through to the research that Cameron spoke about the impact of crises on corporations via Sarah and the MyOsh team later today. But thank you very much for your time and this morning and this afternoon. We really appreciate it. Great.
All right, thank you to you too, Cameron and Ben. That was absolutely great. So as I said, Elliot, we'll send out the email in a few hours with, there's 2 links that I have shared in the Q&A panel to communicating a research paper, communicating through a crisis, and also another one about COVID, the anatomy of crisis. COVID-19, is business ready for a second spike? So those links are in the chat, but they'll also go with the email. Thank you, guys. That was great. Next week, we have a webinar on asbestos in construction. So I've sent a link if everybody would like to register for that one too. All right. So thank you, everyone. Hope you have a good rest of your day. Bye.
Thank you.
Cheers. Bye.